For this track, I took a lot of inspiration from an artist called McFly, a Florida-based producer who makes hip-hop inspired indie rock, or at least that's probably the best way that I can describe it. For this specific track, I'll be taking a lot of inspiration from the songs Overwinter, Take It Slow, and Nightmares. Let's go over some of the elements of these songs that make them what they are. Overwinter consists of a ukulele, a singer, a kick and clap pattern, some background percussion, and a fat 808. Take It Slow is very similar in instrumentation, except that it has just a few more elements. A hi-hat, an open hat, and a respace, as well as the aforementioned elements in Overwinter. Nightmares is built along the same lines as well, except it uses a synth line instead of a ukulele or guitar. Let's break these elements down into a list of things we want to keep. First, minimal instrumentation, meaning we're only going to use 1 to 3 sounds in the melody and chord structure of the song. Second, a fat, room-shaking 808 that will lend a solid bass to the track. Third, a minimal drum pattern that focuses on the interplay between the kick and clap with some background percussion. And fourth, minimal transitions and an intro that starts reverbed out and slowly comes into the foreground. With our list of elements set up, let's move on to beat construction. The first thing I wanted to do was get the bass right. The fat 808 underneath the track is a huge element that contributes to the sound of McFly's music. Since I didn't really have any quick thoughts regarding which of my 10,000 808 samples I could use, I decided to make my own. To do this, I used Silent 1 to create a really smooth bass tone, distort it a little bit, add a tiny bit of compression, and end up with this. Before I come up with a bass line to use it for, however, I had to figure out my drums and melody first. The next thing that I thought was really important to nail was the background percussion. I know it seems small, but little things like that add quite a bit of atmosphere to the track. I used some sample I found in my library that was supposed to be some kind of click, tick-tock sound, adjusted it to the BPM of the track, added a flanger and some widening effects to give it some movement, and then made a groove by selectively deleting parts of it. Up next, the rest of the drums. McFly uses minimalistic but hard-hitting drums, understated but present. I decided to use a really heavy kick and add some EQ to highlight the bass thump of the sound. I layered 2 different snare sounds together to get a nice clicky snare and added some EQ'd reverb to give the snare some space within the mix. I also added a heavily EQ'd open hat to add a little bounce to the drums. After selecting my sounds, I arranged a kick and snare rhythm that is slightly off-kilter, but conventionally hip-hop enough to recreate the feeling of one of McFly's drum lines. Now that my drums have been figured out, it's time to move on to tonal elements. I decided to use synth lines instead of real instruments because I can't play any real instruments, and my forte is synth sound design, so I'm going to play to my strengths. To that end, I designed 4 different synth lines. My first synth line is a chord progression that drives the tonal content of the track. The next 2 synths are riffs and interesting sounds that are sprinkled into the main chord progression to give it some spice. The last synth I used to create a B-side for the song. I used 2 different instances of Silent for it so that I could have one instance playing a slightly edited version of the sound that rises in pitch as it plays. I also used a small vocal chop to add just a tiny bit more variation in the song, and a swoosh to lead into the synth sounds as well. With these sounds, I was able to put together an A pattern, B pattern, and bass line for the song. The A pattern sounds like this. The B pattern sounds like this. And the bass line sounds like this. With my sounds selected, it's time to move on to structure. McFly's song structure is fairly simple. In the songs that I'm drawing inspiration from, he usually starts with an intro that is reverbed out or has some record or analog noise over it, and then slowly moves into the actual meat of the song. He also doesn't go overboard with transitions, preferring to let musical riffs carry the listener from section to section. The drum patterns are often consistent throughout, and not much change occurs with the percussive elements in general. I decided to do much the same thing with my track. I started with an intro that contained a reverbed out version of the chord progression I used, where the breaks for the riffs were filled in. This slowly transitions to the progression as it sounds in the beat, and I used a vocal sweep to lead into it as well. I also drop in on the snare instead of the first kick to allow the progression to breathe for a beat instead of immediately introducing the drums. To transition from the A side to B side of the track, I used a riff with the B side synth to lead into the melody of the B side. I also do the same thing with dropping in on the snare, again to let the melodic elements breathe and introduce themselves for a beat before the drums come in. After I had these transitions sorted out, the rest of the beat basically structured itself. I just brought it back to the A side to round out the last third of the beat, much like McFly does in his tracks, and the beat was done. Let's give the finished product a listen. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video or found it entertaining or informative in any way, make sure to comment, subscribe, and ring the bell, as more will be coming. Like I said in the preface, I'm going to try and get one of these out every 2 weeks or so, and I already know what I'm doing for my next project. It's a bit silly, so I won't reveal it here, but rest assured it's going to be good. Have a great one, and don't forget to make dope shit.